Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador, and in this video tutorial I'm going to cover the subject of firmware updates, not only for your Sony cameras but also for your Sony lenses. Now the first thing is you probably want to know how to find out whether there's an update for your camera or lens. Now if you have the Imaging Edge application on your smartphone, you will get the news section of when a firmware update for your camera becomes available. If you click on one of those links, you'll be taken over to another link which will take you to Sony's website for the downloads. You will, however, need to download this to your computer and not your smartphone. Now, if you go onto your camera, you will be able to find that the firmware version that you're currently running. This will give you an idea of whether you need to upgrade your firmware or not. Now, on one of the later model cameras, you'll just go to the yellow toolbox menu, the last menu, and also look for setup option version. If you're running the older menus on the older Sony Alpha cameras, it will be the last page in the menus there. Okay, so once you've ascertained the version, you'll see that I'm currently running this version 1.3 on my Alpha 1. You'll also see that there is another version down below that, and that is the lens version. Now this will change depending on what lens you have attached to the camera. So if you're buying a new lens, then it should already be updated by Sony. Same with the camera firmware as well. But if you've owned this lens for a considerable amount of time, it is worth checking that you're running both the latest firmware for your camera and also the Sony Alpha lenses you're using. Okay, so here is the version 01 on this particular lens that I'm running on this Alpha 1 camera. Now you may want to just pause the video. Basically I'm recording this video tutorial in the middle of 2022, and these are the current firmware versions for the late model Alpha cameras. In the middle column there, I've got the date of when these firmware releases were made available. And then I've also got notable benefits and improvements. Sometimes these firmware updates correct a couple of bugs maybe. Sometimes they add new features to the camera which you may want to access. So as I said, you may want to pause this and just check whether your camera is running the current firmware or not. If you decide that you do need to update your firmware, then you can just go to sony.com, look for that support link at the top there, and then you'll type in your model of camera. You'll start this with ILC-E dash. Now ILC is for interchangeable lens camera, the E is for your E-mount camera, and then -1 for this Alpha 1. If you've got running a 7 series camera, just put in 7, and obviously a 9 series, 9. Okay, so one of the things that I would point out, however, is if you're running an Alpha 7R Mark IV, there are actually two versions of this camera. There's the original Alpha 7R IV. There's also the newer Alpha 7R IV-A. This is the version with the higher resolution monitor. So it is worth checking you're downloading the correct firmware for the correct model of camera. Otherwise, that could lead to a little bit of frustration further down the track. So just beware of that Mark IV-A version of that particular camera. Once you've done that, you'll go to the downloads section. You can also access manuals for the camera. Now I also create 500-page ebooks manuals for these cameras, so head over to patreon.com if you want a larger and more in-depth camera manual for your particular camera. Now right at the bottom there, you'll also see that you can download either a Mac version or a Windows version of the firmware update. Okay, so once you go over to that, if you are running an Apple Mac, it is a little bit more of an involved process, I have to say. You do have to change the security of the Apple that you're running to allow the Apple computer to run the firmware update. It is further complicated because Apple has over the last year or so has been running their new silicon M1 chips, and these require a different Sony camera driver to unlock those security preferences for those newer computers. If you're running one of the later Intel processor Apple, you'll be downloading a different Sony camera driver. As I said, it is a little bit complex for Apple users. If you're at all fazed by this process, just see if you could perhaps use a friend's PC computer for the update, because it is a slightly simpler process if we do it on a PC rather than a Mac. Sony do give you a link there to how to change the security policies. It is a little bit more involved with the new M1 chips. You do have to reboot the computer and change those security policies before running the firmware update. And down at the bottom there, you'll see that there's different Sony camera drivers that you have to run before running the firmware update. Of course, there's the Apple Silicon, which is the M1 chips, and the older Intel processors. So make sure you download the correct one for your particular Mac. Now, of course, if you're running one of the new Silicon Macs, the M1 chips, when you reboot the computer, you'll lose the your web browser's detailed instructions about how to update those policies. So what Sony have done there is there's a QR code which you can scan with the phone, so you can get those update instructions on your phone while you're doing the security policy changes on your Mac computer. So as I said, that will require that you reboot the Mac in order to invoke those changes. Now, I would like to say that it would be good if Sony allow us to update the firmware via a file copied to a memory card. Now, there is some sort of idea that this may actually happen. I did notice on the new Alpha 7 IV camera there is a software update button that doesn't appear on the other Alpha cameras, but this is the newest Alpha camera and we do have that button. But of course, when Sony released a new firmware update for the Alpha 7 IV, of course that button didn't become an active button for that firmware update. Hopefully it's something that Sony is planning further down the track, because it obviously would make things a little bit easier for especially for the Mac users with their Sony Alpha cameras. Now there is a series of update tips here. Again, you might want to just pause or do a screen grab of this screen. I noticed that Brian Smith, a Sony artisan in the USA, has got a much longer version of what I'm showcasing here. He calls it his bulletproof guide to updating your camera's firmware there. But I'll just run through these, and if you find this is a little bit daunting for you, perhaps you could ask your camera store where you purchase your camera to see if they would offer an update process. I am aware that there's a couple of camera stores in Melbourne where I'm recording this video tutorial who do offer this service for customers who have purchased the camera from them. Okay, so let's just run through these top 8 tips here. It's important not to allow the computer to go to sleep during the update process. So just check that in the preferences of your computer it doesn't go to sleep after 10 minutes, because the update is likely to take longer than 15 minutes. Okay, I would also advise closing all other software programs. I would also pause any cloud services. This makes sure that your computer has the undivided attention to updating the firmware for your camera. I would remove external drives and devices. I would connect the USB cable directly from the camera to the USB port on the computer, not via a USB hub. I would insert a fully charged battery into the camera, because obviously it is going to take longer than 15 minutes. I would remove the SD cards from the camera. This is because when the camera reboots, you don't want other applications opening up wanting to import images from that. So that's not going to happen if you remove the SD cards from the camera. I would also use the USB cable that came with your camera or an equivalent. There are some micro USB cables that won't perform this update service. Okay, so they're just for other duties. So just make sure you are running running a compatible cable. So if the update doesn't happen for any reason, just check you do have the right cable. Okay, so that basically covers it. If you are using one of the later model Sony cameras, you would be using the USB-C cable, and that USB-C cable should facilitate that update. And as I said, Brian Smith goes into a little bit more detail, giving that bulletproof guide to firmware updates. So let's take a look at the lens firmware updates. A lot of people actually don't realize there are firmware updates for the lenses as well. You do have to attach the lens to do the firmware update because each lens that you attach might be running a slightly different firmware. Okay, so you will download the firmware update, and again on a Mac you might see an update setting tool which you have to run before running the actual firmware update. So that is again something else to check. And of course, if you're running one of the later model Apples, you may have to run that Sony camera driver before running a lens firmware update as well. Now I have noticed on Sony's website for these alpha lens updates, sometimes they haven't got the details about running the Sony camera driver on some of the older lenses, but if you're running a newer Mac you will have to do that process as well. Now I'm going to give you another list of lenses. Now I may have missed one or two, but I've tried to get them all here. I'm listing all of the lenses that have had a lens firmware update since these lenses were first released. These are all of the GM lenses. If your GM lens doesn't appear in that list, then there's a good chance that it hasn't had a firmware update since its release. So here again for my patrons, these will be hyperlinks so they can click to go to the firmware update page on Sony's website. And now I'll just move forward to the G lenses and Zeiss design lenses. A lot of the earlier Zeiss design lenses, they all had firmware updates, so there was a faster startup period, so there wasn't a delay when starting up the camera. And then of course they carried on with more updates just to improve general performance of those lenses. I could only find one G lens that had a firmware update, and again that was a very early G lens. That was the 7200 f4. And then we've got a couple of firmware updates for just standard non-G or GM lenses, and that's the FE2870. That's again one of the original Sony lenses that came with the E-mount cameras, and then the 50mm f1.8 lenses also had an update to improve stability of autofocus there. So again, you might want to just freeze that, take a screen grab just to make sure all of your lenses are up to date. Okay, so if you found this useful and you're wanting ongoing support, just remember I do run a Patreon support service over at patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. Now I have Q&A forums, I have 500-page ebooks for your Sony Alpha cameras. On various of the Sony cameras, I also make available cam set files that can set up your entire camera from a file copied to a memory card. I also have member-only seminars. There's over 20 hours of those member-only seminars that you can find. And again, just there are these in-depth camera ebooks which people have found exceptionally valuable. They don't just tell you what the features are, they show you how to create groups of settings to photograph particular genres such as portrait, action, birds in flight, landscapes, etc., etc. So I will help you get the best possible performance out of your Sony Alpha camera. And of course there are all of those seminar archives, over 20 hours of video tutorials to watch to build your skills as a photographer. Okay, so hopefully you found this useful, and I'll catch you online next time. Just hit the subscribe button if you found this useful, and you'll get notified of when I next release video tutorials. I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.